Welcome back to the Perfectly Almost podcast.
We've spent 50 episodes scoring U.S. states on this exact system. Now we're taking the same scorecard global.
Because homelessness looks radically different depending on the country.
Exactly.
Today, we are building a scorecard for Sweden, focusing entirely on the lived reality and the systems in place.
And just so you know, the score will evolve dynamically during this deep dive.
Right, it will not be revealed all at once. Let's move directly into the country overview.
So to really understand Sweden's approach, we first have to look at the scale and the demographics. Because the numbers here, they actually surprise a lot of people.
Oh, sure.
Sweden actually has the highest rate of homelessness in Scandinavia.
Wait, really? The highest?
Yeah, the highest. The data shows a rate of 3.3 homeless individuals per 1,000 inhabitants.
Okay, so what does that look like in, raw numbers?
Well, looking at their national mapping, there were over 33,000 homeless people counted in 2017. And a subsequent count in 2023 showed over 27,000.
Right, and who those individuals are is shifting significantly.
Yes, drastic.
It's moving away from the older historical stereotypes. We're seeing more women, more families with children, and a really sharp increase in individuals with a migration background.
Right. In fact, people with a migration background now make up 58% of the acute homeless population.
Which is wild when you think about what usually comes to mind when you hear Sweden. You probably picture, the ultimate utopian welfare state, right?
Oh, exactly. Flawless safety nets, free healthcare.
Yeah, an incredibly high standard of living.
Yeah.
But the lived experience for these shifting demographics paints a very different picture.
It really does. And to establish a baseline for you, we have to contrast the Swedish system with what you might be familiar with in the United States.
Because it's a completely different framework.
Right. In the U.S., the baseline understanding of homelessness is typically rooflessness, so people sleeping rough on the street or in emergency shelters.
Right.
But Sweden uses a much broader definition based on the European ethos typology.
Wait, before we move on to the tiers, let's unpack that acronym for the listener. What actually is the ethos typology?
So it stands for the European Typology of Homelessness and Housing Exclusion.
Okay.
It's basically a standardized framework used across Europe to categorize different living situations. This way, policymakers can measure housing exclusion as a broad spectrum, rather than just a simple housed or unhoused binary.
That makes sense. So how does Sweden use it?
Well, Sweden recognizes 4 specific situations under this framework. First is acute homelessness, which is the rooflessness we just mentioned.
Right, the typical definition.
Yeah.
Here.
Second is institutional care for those about to be released from hospitals or prisons with nowhere to go.
Okay.
Third is private short-term arrangements, so like couch surfing. And fourth is a uniquely Swedish category, long-term social service arrangements.
And that fourth tier is really where the U.S. comparison completely fractures, because it heavily involves this massive secondary housing market. In Sweden, municipal social services literally hold the apartment leases for marginalized individuals who can't secure housing on their own.
Right. It is a completely parallel managed housing system.
You aren't on the street, but you don't hold your own lease either.
It's a critical structural difference, which leads us directly into why that secondary market even has to exist in the first place.
Right.
And that starts with our first category on the scorecard, housing affordability.
Let's get into it.
So to understand the Swedish housing market, you really have to understand their rent control system. They operate on a utility value system.
And that's theoretically designed to keep rents fair and affordable, right?
Theoretically, yes.
Let's translate that for folks used to a free market system. What does a utility value system actually look like in practice? Are government officials literally going in and deciding what a one-bedroom apartment is worth based on, its appliances or how close it is to a train station?
Essentially, yes. Rents for what they call first-hand contracts, which are direct leases with the property owner, are negotiated collectively.
Wow.
Yeah, they look at the standard, the size, the location, and the amenities, rather than just what the free market is willing to pay.
So rents are held far below the market rate.
Exactly.
Now think about how you typically view rent control. Usually it's championed as a lifesaver for the working class. But what you see in Sweden is kind of the dark side of that exact policy.
Yeah, it creates what researchers call a ceiling trap.
Right, because the rent is artificially low. Nobody ever gives up a first-hand contract. If you secure one, You basically hold on to it for life.
You never let it go. So to get an apartment, you have to join the municipal housing queue. And this isn't some metaphorical wait list.
So it's a literal numbered queue.
Oh.
Almost 1 million people are currently registered.
And the wait times are staggering. The average wait time for an apartment is about 9 years.
9 years.
Yeah. And if you want an attractive address in inner city Stockholm, you can expect to wait up to 20 years.
That's just, I mean, you have this beautiful, orderly system, but it is fundamentally inaccessible to someone starting from zero.
Right. The Swedish social democrat and Nobel laureate Gunnar Myrdal famously observed his own country's rent control system and called it perhaps the worst example of poor planning by governments lacking courage.
Because when the supply cannot meet the demand doesn't just disappear.
Exactly. It forces desperate people into the shadows.
Let's compare this to a high-stakes game of musical chairs where the music stopped a decade ago and no one ever stands up. How is someone with zero housing history, maybe a mother fleeing domestic violence or someone dealing with a sudden financial crisis, supposed to compete in a game where everyone else has been sitting down for 10 years?
They simply cannot. And the systemic impact is that desperate families are forced into the black market.
Right.
They end up renting from slumlords on precarious illegal subleases. And here is the truly devastating mechanism behind that lived reality.
The housing allowances.
Yes. Because they are renting on the black market, they do not have a legally recognized lease. And without a legal lease, they are legally prevented from claiming the government housing allowances they desperately need to survive.
Because the financial aid system requires an official contract to disperse funds.
Exactly. So the system designed to protect affordable housing actively excludes the most vulnerable from accessing it.
This lowers the overall picture. Based on this, the current draft score is a D.
Let's transition to Category 2, shelter access.
Right, because if the front door to permanent housing is essentially bricked over by this 10-year queue, what happens to the people left standing outside in the Swedish winter? How do they survive the night?
Well, when people fall through the cracks completely, they enter that first ethos tier, acute homelessness.
Which is about 5,900 people in Sweden, right?
Yeah, around 5,900 people fall into this category, meaning they are entirely reliant on emergency accommodations or sleeping rough.
And the lived reality here is dictated by the clock. It is an intense, time-dictated daily grind.
It's harrowing.
We have accounts from individuals living roofless, and you have to call the emergency shelter at exactly 5 p.m. just to see if a bed is available. It is a daily lottery.
And if you are denied,
you're sitting in a McDonald's until 2 a.m. because that's one of the only places open, warm, and relatively safe.
And when McDonald's closes and public transport stops running between 2 a.m. and 4:30 a.m., you are forced out.
You wander the streets in the freezing cold. You just walk, keeping your body moving to generate heat and stay warm, waiting for the central station to finally open its doors at 4:30 a.m. so you can go inside and sit down in the light again.
It is a profound failure of the safety net.
How is it possible to rebuild your life, address trauma, or prepare for a job interview when your absolute full-time job is merely surviving the clock?
You can't.
Every ounce of your cognitive energy is spent calculating where you can sit without being moved along and how you will survive the next 6 hours without freezing.
This shifts the score. Based on this, the current draft score is a D-. And the sheer exhaustion of that daily cycle leads us directly into our third category: criminalization and enforcement.
Because how does the state manage the people who are stuck waiting for the central station to open?
Interestingly, there are no federal laws in Sweden that explicitly criminalize homelessness itself.
Right, but there is the Swedish Act on Public Order.
Yes.
This legislation allows local municipalities to draft their own ordinances to restrict basic survival-level behaviors. They can legally restrict where you can drink alcohol, where you can sleep in a car, or where you can camp out.
We are also seeing a significant rise in hostile architecture and local zero-tolerance policies.
Like what happened in Gothenburg.
Exactly. Major cities like Gothenburg have implemented policies aggressively targeting littering and loitering, going as far as removing comfortable park benches and entirely closing down public restrooms in certain areas.
Now, we need to look at this impartially and understand the arguments from both sides of the policy debate. Supporters of these enforcement policies argue that they are absolutely necessary to maintain public order and cleanliness. From their perspective, these rules successfully turn the city into a shared public common room that all citizens, local businesses, and tourists can enjoy safely and comfortably without encountering disorder.
Conversely, critics contend that these policies rely heavily on border control tactics and private security guards to forcibly push out homeless individuals.
Yeah.
They argue that this negatively impacts vulnerable populations by effectively criminalizing basic human survival in public spaces. The critics point out that removing a bench or closing a restroom doesn't remove the need to sit or use facilities. It merely pushes the problem out of sight rather than solving it.
This lowers the overall picture. Based on this, the current draft score is an F.
And that brings us to our midpoint score moment.
For you listening, imagine a preliminary score overlay on your screen right now, clearly labeled the draft score. Currently, Sweden is sitting at an F.
But we want to emphasize heavily that this is not the final score.
Exactly, not the final score. We still have 3 major categories left to evaluate, and these remaining systems could significantly alter the ultimate verdict.
Which brings us to Category 4, vehicle dwelling friendliness.
Right, because if you can't get an apartment and the emergency shelters are full at 5 p.m., what happens if you scrape together enough for a vehicle and try to live in it?
Well, the rules for motorhomes and vehicle dwelling in Sweden exist in a very complex legal gray area. Sleeping in a legally parked vehicle is generally not against the law at the federal level.
Okay, so if it's not federally illegal, it sounds like vehicle dwelling might actually be a viable loophole to the housing crisis here.
You would think so, but you were forgetting about those local municipal ordinances we just discussed.
Right.
The local ordinances, known as Allmänna ordnings for Skrifter, often explicitly prohibit overnight stays in specific areas, especially in residential zones or city centers.
So the lived reality remains incredibly precarious. If you are living in a vehicle, you can legally stay for up to 24 hours in some roadside rest areas that are maintained by the Swedish Transport Agency.
But those are highway rest stops, not long-term residential solutions.
Exactly. Finding secure, long-term parking where you won't be fined or harassed is extremely difficult. Official travel parks exist. They're called stellplatser, but they cost money.
Right.
So if you are homeless and relying on a vehicle for shelter, especially during a freezing Swedish winter, you are constantly on the move, dodging municipal fines and struggling to find a safe place to simply park and sleep for free.
This shifts the score. Based on this, the current draft score is an F+.
Slightly better than an F, I guess.
Yeah, it is slightly better than outright criminalization nationwide, but still heavily restricted by local geography. Let's move to Category 5, outreach and social services.
This is a huge one.
It is. In Sweden, national housing authorities do not bear the ultimate legal responsibility for homelessness the municipal social services do.
And the lived reality of interacting with these social services is really a tale of 2 extremes. Let's start with the good, because there is genuine support here.
Yeah, there is.
We have the documented experience of a woman named Ellen. She visits open day centers provided by NGOs and the municipality. At these centers, she gets clean clothes, a hot shower, and most importantly, she is treated with basic human dignity.
That's so crucial.
The staff treat her with absolute respect, and she describes it as a safe haven where she is never told no when asking for basic hygiene needs. She gets to feel human for a few hours.
That represents the safety net functioning at its best. But the structural barrier to accessing more substantial help, like a bed or an apartment, is defined by severe gatekeeping.
Right.
Access is entirely contingent on proving to social workers that you absolutely cannot obtain housing on your own.
Which leads to incredibly rigid bureaucratic outcomes. Take the specific story of Arthur.
This one's rough.
He was seeking entry to an emergency shelter on a freezing cold night. He was denied entry and turned away into the freezing weather, simply because he refused to abandon his dog.
Yeah.
The shelter rules strictly did not allow pets, and the system offered absolutely no flexibility.
It highlights how rigid institutional rules entirely ignore the complex lived realities and emotional attachments of the people they are supposed to serve.
Exactly.
A pet might be a person's only source of security and companionship on the street, but the bureaucracy views it merely as a rule violation.
This shifts the score. Based on this, the current draft score is a D. The presence of those high-quality day centers provides a bump, but the inflexible gatekeeping holds it back.
Which brings us to our final category, Category 6, pathways to permanent housing.
We mentioned earlier the massive secondary housing market. Nearly 16,000 people are housed in this system.
Right.
It's organized by the social services, where they place people in sublease apartments. But think about what that is actually like. It is essentially having an overbearing landlord who works for the government.
Yeah, with massive strings attached.
These apartments come with strict supervision, surprise inspections, and behavioral rules. It effectively keeps marginalized individuals segregated from the primary market, treating housing as a reward for good behavior rather than a fundamental right.
But there is a contrasting model gaining traction, the Housing First model. In pilot programs backed by Lund University and implemented in cities like Helsingborg, they inverted the traditional logic.
Okay, how so?
They provided permanent housing to individuals without requiring prior abstinence from substances or strict behavioral compliance.
So no hoops to jump through first.
Exactly. They offered support, but the housing was unconditional.
And the results are stunning. 85% of the individuals in that program successfully kept their homes.
It's incredible.
But I have to push back here. If the empirical evidence shows an 85% success rate for a housing-led strategy, why does Housing First remain a tiny, almost negligible fraction of the overall Swedish system?
It's a great question.
Especially while municipalities continue to actively sell off their public housing stock to private developers. It feels like the systemic momentum is actively working against the proven evidence.
That is the core tension in Swedish housing policy right now. Decades ago, the state shifted housing responsibility to the municipalities, and many municipalities are now operating their housing companies for profit.
Ah, of course.
The secondary market persists because it allows social services to maintain control, while the municipalities focus on profitable development, even when unconditional housing proves vastly more effective.
This raises the overall picture. Based on this, the current draft score is a C-.
The proven success of these pilot programs shows what is possible, even if the systemic implementation is lagging.
We've covered a tremendous amount of ground today. Let's pull back and look at the final summary of Sweden's approach to homelessness.
Let's do it.
Looking at the major strengths, Sweden possesses a remarkably strong municipal safety net on paper. When individuals access D centers, they receive high-quality care, and the proven success of their Housing First pilots in cities like Helsingborg demonstrates that they have the precise blueprints for a highly effective, compassionate system.
But the major weaknesses are crippling.
Yeah. The severe housing supply shortage caused by the rent control ceiling trap, the rigid bureaucratic gatekeeping by social services, and the punitive, time-dictated shelter rules create a landscape that is incredibly difficult to navigate.
Let's finalize the scorecard. Here are the final letter grades for all 6 individual categories. Housing affordability grade, F.
Shelter access grade, D.
Criminalization and enforcement grade, D.
Vehicle dwelling friendliness grade, C.
Outreach and social services grade, B.
Pathways to permanent housing grade, C.
Bringing all of those systemic realities and lived experiences together, the final perfectly homeless country score for Sweden is a D+.
Sweden earns a D+ because its robust, well-intentioned social safety net is fundamentally undermined by a paralyzed, exclusionary housing market that traps its most vulnerable citizens in a perpetual cycle of temporary conditional survival.
It leaves you with a really uncomfortable question to mull over. If a welfare state builds a flawless safety net but completely forgets to build the floor underneath it, can it really be called a safety net at all?
That's the perfectly homeless country score for Sweden.
Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you on the next one.
If you'd like to support the project, visit the Perfectly Homeless Etsy store and pick up a PH hoodie. Every purchase helps fund future episodes and keeps these stories in front of the public. Wear the logo. Start a conversation. Because homelessness isn't someone else's problem anymore.